James Phillips is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He joins me now in D.C. James, thank you very much for being with us this hour. So, James, we see the U.S. economic maximum pressure system on Tehran on the one hand, and some people might say, well, that hasn't really worked out. Can economic pressure on Lebanon bring the U.S. the result it desires?
Well, I think pressure on Lebanon alone won't accomplish much, but I think continued pressure on Hezbollah is very much called for. And Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, prefers to operate behind closed doors, kind of like the Wizard of Oz, behind the screen. And if you've ever seen that movie, at one point the wizard says, "Don't look behind the curtain." The fact that Prime Minister Hariri has resigned, I think, has exposed Hezbollah and has exposed the fact that it's working behind the curtain to control Lebanon.
And in fact, James, there are concerns that Hezbollah and its allies, one of them, the president, Michel Aoun, hold a 71 majority in the government. If, in fact, they do not take over, is there concern of a power vacuum in Lebanon, as we've seen elsewhere in the Middle East?
I think there is a concern by Hezbollah leaders about losing power, which could lead to a vacuum. But I think Washington shares Jerusalem's concern about Hezbollah's creeping influence within the Lebanese government. And Washington is very reluctant to rescue that government if it's only going to redound to the benefit of Hezbollah and Iran.
We know, James, that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo this week called on the Lebanese army to make sure that the rights of the protesters are safe and that they are safe, and that they called for an end on the violence. But is the U.S. supporting the protests in Lebanon, or is that too far?
I would say the U.S. supports the rights of the protesters and has called on the Lebanese government to respond with appropriate restraint. But I think the U.S. does not want to get too far forward in terms of supporting protesters, because that would only vindicate Hezbollah's propaganda that these protests are directed from outside Lebanon and supported by not only the U.S., but Saudi Arabia and Israel.
James, we know that Israel, at least according to reports, also asked international donors to stop the aid or consider stopping the aid to Beirut following the turmoil. Do we have any indication whether or not that impacted the State Department's decision?
I have seen no clear evidence that that was an impact, but I think behind the scenes, the State Department and Secretary of State Pompeo are working very closely with not only the international donor community, but with Israel to try to arrive at a more stable situation in Lebanon. And as long as Iranian sophisticated arms are flowing in, and Iran is helping Hezbollah set up factories to build more increasingly accurate and longer range missiles, then I don't think that stability is likely to continue.
And as you know, James, and you mentioned after the president, Prime Minister al-Hariri resigned, the protesters were not pleased. They're calling for a complete overhaul of the political system in Lebanon. But does al-Hariri's resignation mean anything in terms of where this protest is going?
Well, if Hezbollah emerges as the king maker in Lebanon in the next government, then that resignation does not mean much. And I think Hariri's resignation really was a blow to Hezbollah, because it exposes them. It removes the fig leaf that they have tried to use to hide to cloak their rising influence within the government. And Nasrallah hypocritically has called for the next government to listen to the protesters, but Hezbollah itself is dragging its feet on building a truly independent government of technocrats, which Hariri was proposing, and that was one of the reasons he resigned.
All right, James Phillips, thank you so much for joining us this hour to shed more insight into the story from the Heritage Foundation in D.C. Thank you.